The project planning process has a lot of components that need to integrate together, and to many new project managers, the whole thing can seem bewildering. So in this video, what I want to do is to go through the elements of the project planning process in a sequence, just so that you can see how the different parts fit together. Now, it's important to note that this sequence is a simplification. Obviously, when you complete one part of the planning process, you may need to go back to an earlier part and review it to make sure that everything is self-consistent. But the sequence I'm going to show you has served me well in understanding how I can build effective project plans. Everything starts off with two things really, and the first is the client's requirements. The second is the problem or the opportunity that the project is setting out to solve. And I'm going to assume, by the way, that you've already done the work that you need to on your project definition. You know what your project is, and you know something about the problem or the solution. You know something about the client's requirements, and can feed all of this into your project planning process. And alongside these two kind of starters, it's also worth mentioning the importance of the team's experience and stakeholders' perceptions, particularly around the problem and the solution that you're trying to implement. So we've got these, and the first step is to feed these in to understand the scope of your project, and you will have done a fair amount of that work in the definition stage. Now, we'll come back to the client's requirements because the scope of work is by and large dictated by the nature of the problem and the solution that you found, and stakeholders' perceptions. Now, in the planning stage, the next thing to consider is to take your broad scope of work and to focus it in detail onto the detailed tasks that are needed. And for this, we use a tool called the work breakdown structure. And it's important to note, by the way, that this is slightly different in the US and US influenced project management arenas from the way that it is in the UK and European project management, where when we talk about a work breakdown structure, we talk about a breakdown of the tasks, the work to be done. So use your work breakdown structure to identify the detailed scope of work. And from your work breakdown structure, you can build two other very valuable planning tools. The first of these is an organization breakdown structure, which is a tool which takes each piece of work in your WBS and allocates it to one or more individuals to give you a breakdown of who is going to be doing what, and we'll come back to this later. The second thing that flows nicely from your work breakdown structure is a cost breakdown structure. Estimate the cost of each piece of work in your WBS, and there you have it. You have a cost breakdown structure. And from this, you can build your project budget. A third thing that you can build from your work breakdown structure is a schedule of deliverables, because the work at the bottom of your WBS, the full scope of work, if you like, also generates the deliverables or the products that you're going to be producing and delivering as part of your project. So you can use this to generate your schedule of deliverables. Now, if you're in the US or you're using a US influenced approach, when you talk about work breakdown structures, you'll actually be breaking down the products, what we in Europe call a product breakdown structure. And so you will go directly from your WBS to your schedule of deliverables or products. This means that you're going to need to work from that WBS to recreate the tasks and therefore the costs and the organizational breakdown structure. So it's slightly different on the two sides of the Atlantic. Wherever you work, one will probably be the preferred default approach. first thing to understand is which is the one that will work for you in your organization and in your culture. Now, once you've got your schedule of deliverables, the next thing you can create are the specification sheets that go with each deliverable. And from that, you can think about your quality management plan and your quality assurance and quality control procedures. All of this has taken us somewhat off the main trunk of our project planning process. So let's go back to that. Let's return to the work breakdown structure. Against each activity in your work breakdown structure, you can now estimate the workload, the time it will take to deliver that piece of work. In fact, in true planning sense, there are two measurable things that you're going to be estimating. The first is the effort it's going to take. That's the number of person hours of work that's going to go into it. And the second is the duration. So, for example, if the effort is 10 person hours and you allocate one person to it, then the duration is going to be 10 hours. If, on the other hand, you allocate 2 people to it, then the duration will be 5 hours for most types of task. And likewise, if you allocate one person to the task, but they can only work half time on the task, then your duration is going to be 20 hours. Now, in parallel to doing this, another important and useful starting point for many project managers when they're planning is to think in terms of the milestones, the stages along the journey from the start of the project to the very end. Some project managers start their planning with milestones and then move on to work breakdown structures. Others do it the opposite way round, but these two approaches are complementary and therefore can be done in parallel. There is no logical sequence of which should come first or second. But what happens when you combine your milestones and therefore the key dates with the durations of the tasks? Now you can start to arrange your tasks into a logical sequence. And that logical sequence gives you a network chart. And when you inject the actual times into your network chart, this then gives you a critical path analysis or a PERT chart approach. This is the tool we use to really understand the sequence of activities, how long each takes, and therefore which activities to prioritize in overseeing your project. Now, the reality is that in many projects these days, project managers don't use network charts, PERT charts, critical paths. What we actually use is the Gantt chart. And the Gantt chart is like a sibling to the network chart. It contains the same information, it just represents it differently. So the Gantt chart represents time information and activity information, but instead of allocating each activity a uniform box size, it stretches the size of the box to represent the duration of the activity, and then it plots them onto a timeline so that each activity is representing not only its duration, but the position represents when you're going to schedule it. The Gantt chart is often seen as the most useful single project planning tool for project managers. Now, it's important also to think about stakeholders, and you'll need to engage with stakeholders and communicate with them. And so, whilst you're building your Gantt chart, it's also essential to start thinking about stakeholder engagement. And so, although it doesn't flow logically from your Gantt chart, stakeholder engagement and your stakeholder engagement management plan is something you're going to be developing at around the same time, and that leads logically into a communication plan of how you're going to communicate between your project and each of your stakeholders. The final element of planning that links directly to the Gantt chart is allocating resources to each task. And of course, we've already done that work when we created our organizational breakdown structure, and therefore it should be straightforward to create a resource allocation schedule of some sort. And once we've got that, we can represent that with tools like RACI charts or linear responsibility charts. But the last thing we have to do to really lock our Gantt chart in as our schedule and to make sure we get it right is what's known as resource leveling, making sure that the resources are allocated to individual tasks in such a way that no individuals are overloaded and that the work is spread evenly across your resource team. Now, you've pretty much finished your planning, but there's one other thing to do. And although strictly this comes under the heading of a project control rather than a project planning tool, I think it's worth mentioning the importance of starting to think about risk management and starting to build your risk register around the timings, the budgets, and the resources that you've got allocated. All the information that has gone into your project plan is subject to variation. You will have made many assumptions, and any of those assumptions could be wrong. Events could hinder any of the activities that you've planned. They could set back timings, incur additional costs, require additional resources. Resources can let you down too. So, the final thing to do in planning your project is to identify risks that arise from each element of your plan and to enter them onto your risk register. So now you have your full suite of project plans and your risk register from which you can manage the delivery of your project. Here's a question I was asked. What's the main deliverable if you're required to produce a project plan? In this video, I'll give you my answer, and it won't be what you're expecting. What's the main deliverable for a project plan? It would be easy to answer that in a conventional way. It's a Gantt chart, it's a work breakdown structure, it's a resource plan, it's a milestone schedule, it's a schedule of deliverables, it's a budget, it's a network chart, it's a... You see what the problem is? There's loads of things it could be, and you're asking me to pick one of them? I'm not going to do that. No one of these deliverables is more important than the others. In some projects, some or other of those deliverables will be more salient and others will be less useful to you as a project manager. On your next project? Well, who can predict? And of course, different project managers will make different choices based on their experience, what they think is important for their project, the needs of their stakeholders, the culture of their organisation. It's impossible to say what the main deliverable is if you just give me a list of project planning tools. Okay, Mike, you say, so what is the main deliverable of a project plan? I'll tell you. The main deliverable of a project plan is confidence. I'd like to say the main deliverable is certainty. Certainty that you'll be able to deliver the capabilities, the assets, the deliverables of your project. But the reality is that projects aren't like that, and certainty is a concept for children and naive project managers. But confidence is vital. Your plan needs to give confidence to your stakeholders, to your team, to your project sponsor or client or boss. And a good plan gives you confidence to know what to do next and next and next. And confidence tells your stakeholders and your funders that they're in safe hands. They know they'll get what they commissioned when they need it, for the price that they agreed to pay, and to the standards and specifications that they've set. And finally, confidence allows your team to know that they are doing what you expect of them. And in that way, it gives you one more credit in the leadership balance sheet. So there you have it. My simple answer to a simple question. The most important deliverable of any project plan is confidence. In this video, I want to answer the question, what is a roadmap? I also want to look at how we use them, how we create them, and how they are different from a Gantt chart. A project roadmap is a visualization of a project's goals, benefits realization, major work streams, and key milestones, all on a timeline. It's a strategic tool, so we can include other things as well to help create a high-level understanding of your project. So you might include other things like resources, risk, deliverables, dependencies, or constraints. There are many good reasons to use a project roadmap. For example, it might help you to articulate your ideas, or even to clarify those ideas for yourself. It can help you identify priorities, key milestones, or dependencies arising from outside of the project, or from different aspects of the project. It can convey important information quickly and in a single view to help with strategic level briefings. As a result, it helps you to communicate ideas and expectations to your stakeholders and to your team members. And as a result, it can help you to coordinate resources between your team and other teams. So, how do roadmaps differ from Gantt charts? A Gantt chart typically works at the level of tasks, with rolled up summaries if you only want an overview. Its purpose is to visualize all the detailed activities that need to happen, when they need to happen, and who needs to be doing them. Roadmaps, on the other hand, work on the level of full functionality deliverables and significant outcomes. They offer a high-level strategic view which avoids the detail of day-to-day tasks. However, they can add narrative that breaks large chunks of information into smaller components. Therefore, you can see the difference between Gantt charts and roadmaps as largely being a matter of degree, the amount of detail that you include. Another difference is that Gantt charts have strictly linear timescales. That is to say that on a Gantt chart, equal distances along the time axis always represent equal amounts of time. Roadmaps are not bound by this convention. We can have different distances along the time axis representing different time scales. Typically, roadmaps use rolling wave planning. That is to say, near-term events are represented by larger distances on the time axis than distant events. So the same spacing might represent the next quarter and the following quarter, but then the same spacing again might represent the remaining half year, and the same spacing again might represent future years. However, because Gantt charts and roadmaps are both useful, but in different contexts, project managers should be using both of them where they serve a particular need. First, develop your roadmap to create a strategic overview of your project. Then, break the strategic goals and milestones down into task-level details that you can put into your more detailed project plan. So, what goes into a project roadmap? What you put into your roadmap needs to focus on only what is essential. And remember, your roadmap is a strategic tier document. So, this list of items for you to consider is a long list. You should think about the specific needs of your project, your organization, and your stakeholders when deciding which items to put onto your roadmap. You can have goals, objectives, and other success measures. Key milestones, such as critical delivery dates or internal or external deadlines. Delivery of major project benefits and essential deliverables. Resources and key individuals. Dependencies, both within and from outside of your project. Significant external initiatives and activities, and important internal work streams and phases. And finally, major project risks that you can identify with likely impact dates. And all of this set against your project timeline. So let's end by considering how to create a project roadmap. You should be developing your project roadmap before you create a detailed project plan. It's a great tool to brief your stakeholders and your team at your project kickoff meeting. And it forms the basis of project planning. So, when you're ready to create a project roadmap, here are the essential steps. Step 1. Break your project down into phases and work streams. Step 2 is to map these out against a timeline that is broken down into quarters or, at most detail, months. Step 3 is to identify and illustrate dependencies between work streams and phases, and also between your work streams and phases and external events that you're aware of. Step 4 is to identify the key benefits and deliverables and to plot these out against when you expect them to happen. Represent these as quarter ends or month ends. And of course, you can also add in other essential project milestones. Step 5, add in any additional information that you think your stakeholders and your team members and your governance organisation will need to help them to do their jobs. It's wise to consider having alternative views, alternative roadmaps, if you like, for each different stakeholder group, for your team members, for your governance boards, for your stakeholders, so that each one gets the information they need and doesn't have their view clouded by additional information which isn't relevant to their requirements. Finally, step 6 is to publicise your roadmap, make it highly visible, and then to keep it up to date. As your project progresses, things will change and you might need to change your roadmap. It's a perfect way to communicate the strategic changes that are happening on your project. So, a project roadmap. You could view it as a simplified version of your project plan, but I prefer to think of it as a strategic view of your project plan. Whichever approach you take, however, a project roadmap is a valuable tool for all project managers. The work breakdown structure is one of the truly fundamental tools of project management. But how do you create one? If you're managing a predictive or a hybrid project of any significant scale, then there's a good chance you'll need a work breakdown structure. So in this video, we're going to look at how you create one. And we'll do it using the globally more common approach of breaking down the project into products or deliverables. And from that, identifying the activities. Now, it's worth mentioning that in the UK, where I come from, I was originally taught that a work breakdown structure broke down the work, the activities, the tasks of the project. And from that, you can determine what the products need to be and link them to the tasks. But American project managers and the Project Management Institute teach the alternative approach. Neither is better nor worse than the other, in my opinion. Both have their advantages and their adherents. But because it is the more common approach, and some would argue maybe the more rigorous approach on technical projects, we're going to break down the project into its deliverables to create a work breakdown structure and then use that to identify the tasks that need to be carried out for future planning and scheduling. So because our work breakdown structure is going to break the project into deliverables, let's start by understanding what they are. Deliverables are products or capabilities or results. For example, a thing, a process, or an event are deliverables. You could argue that a deliverable is anything tangible that you can experience. So, to create a work breakdown structure, all we need is a hierarchical decomposition of all of the deliverables. And because it's all of the deliverables, it means that if it's not on the work breakdown structure, it won't get done in your project. So it's absolutely crucial that we do it in a systematic way so we don't miss anything. Now, you'll find a lot of variance on the process that I'm going to give you, and I don't claim that my approach is any more nor less correct than any others. But what I do want to focus on is being crystal clear about the levels within a work breakdown structure. So at the top of our work breakdown structure, we have level 0. This is the product, deliverable, or project that we are going to create through the project. It is the totality of the entire deliverable set and therefore the project itself. Level 1 is what I am going to call the key line, and this is not a commonly used term. The key line is our organizing principle for the work breakdown structure. It sets up the categories by which we're going to decompose our deliverables. Now, sometimes the key line is nothing more complex than a few deliverables, the biggest deliverables of all. In other circumstances, it may be the stages or phases of the project. It may be work streams that are thematic in nature, like technology, people, and processes. Or it could even be a geographic set of divisions. However, once you set up the principle against which you're going to decompose the entire project, that gives you level 1, your key line, and therefore sets out the titles for the major work streams for your project. At level 2, we have the major deliverables that sit within each element of the key line. Not all of these deliverables need to be an end deliverable. An end deliverable is something you want. It is there because that is what the project has been created to build. End deliverables are often defined by the goal and the objectives of the project. The alternative is interim deliverables, and you may see some at level 2, but they are more likely to appear at level 3. But while we're at level 2, the key here is to use expertise, the experts on your project team, to identify the major end deliverables and the major interim deliverables. So at level 3, we will see components of the major deliverables, and we will see a large number of interim deliverables. Interim deliverables are things we need to create in the project in order to help us get to the end deliverables. Typically, they include things like prototypes and tests. They include project management artifacts like plans and stakeholder lists. They include things like test scripts and maybe even components that we don't need, but that will find their way into the end deliverables. So to create level 3, we need to brainstorm the sub-deliverables and the interim deliverables for each of the items at level 2. Remember, because if it's not on the work breakdown structure, it won't get done. Be sure to include project management process deliverables, the artifact of project management. And one way to do that, of course, and my preference, is to set up a project management heading at the key line level. That way, you can decompose your approach to project management into a number of major and then sub-deliverables at levels 2 and 3. Remember, everything in this workstream will of course be an interim deliverable by definition, because it's not something we want as an end product, it is something we need to create along the way. If you do create this project level workstream at the key line, typical names would be project management or project integration. Level 4 and maybe levels below this further decompose the sub-deliverables and the interim deliverables into smaller and smaller deliverables to the point where each deliverable is a unique and fully constrained thing in itself. Make sure that these are structured into logical hierarchies and, as far as possible, sequenced in a logical order. And of course, it may not look tidy, but it is okay to go to different depths, different numbers of levels at different parts of the work breakdown structure, because your work breakdown structure should be determined by the work that needs to be done, not by some platonic ideal of a perfect, neat work breakdown structure. The next thing to do is to document your work breakdown structure. We start by creating a work breakdown structure index. We number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on across the key line. Then, starting with the first element, we look at the sub-deliverables on line 2. and we number them 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and so on. Every item on your work breakdown structure will have an index number in that format. And that format should look very familiar to you, because it is very easy to create a work breakdown structure using a simple word processing package like Word or Pages. You have a number of ways that you can present this. You can present it as a hierarchical list, or as a tree diagram, which is commonly presented as, particularly in a training context, but for a large project is rarely practical. Or you can create a work breakdown structure dictionary, a WBS dictionary, which lists every product with its reference number, but now you can add additional information. You can add descriptions, standards, specifications, resources, costs, durations, and anything else that is relevant to you to create your work breakdown structure dictionary. The final step is to present your work breakdown structure to your project sponsor, to your client, to your boss, to your steering group, and indeed to your stakeholders. Get their feedback on it and refine it before producing your final version. Your completed work breakdown structure is now a full and formal statement of the complete scope of your project. Before we turn our deliverable-based work breakdown structure into an activity tool that we can use for planning and scheduling, let's look at some good practices in creating your work breakdown structure. First, make sure the labels of each item in your work breakdown structure provide a clear and unambiguous description of what that deliverable is. Secondly, apply the MEIS principle. Is your work breakdown structure mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive? What do we mean by mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive? By mutually exclusive, we mean there are no overlaps, that the same deliverable doesn't appear twice or more times in different parts of the work breakdown structure. And by collectively exhaustive, we mean that any deliverable at a level can be completely specified by all the sub-deliverables below it. That is to say that the entire work breakdown structure does indeed represent the complete project and everything you need, both your end deliverables, the components of the end deliverables, and your interim deliverables. Now, it's worth noting that on many modern projects where they are moving from a purely predictive to a more hybrid style of project management, it isn't always going to be appropriate to try to complete the work breakdown structure at the start of the project. The project may evolve and you may need to add elements or indeed delete elements from your work breakdown structure as you go through the project, discover new requirements, learn more about the project you're doing. So whilst I grew up in a predictive environment where we would create a full work breakdown structure before moving out of the planning phase into delivery, that isn't necessarily going to be your approach in every project. Now you've got your deliverable-based work breakdown structure, how do you understand the tasks, the activities it takes to create your project? The first step is to create work packages, to identify deliverables or groups of deliverables that need to be created together, and set up work packages that collectively develop those deliverables. Typically, you will have one work package create one deliverable, but that won't always be the case. And also, typically you'll allocate the task of creating this work package decomposition to your workstream leaders who understand the tasks and the deliverables within their workstream better than you do. Once they've created the work packages, they will decompose those into the individual activities that need to be done. These can be then arranged into logical sequences and you can estimate time and resources against them and indeed budget for them. And that's the third step. Planning is about taking the sequence of activities that you identified, taking the estimates of how much work it takes to deliver them and the duration of those activities and putting them into a schedule and building a budget. So from a work breakdown structure, you can determine the dependencies, estimate durations, allocate resources into those tasks, and therefore estimate costs. So now I hope you can see why I describe the work breakdown structure as a fundamental project management tool. It's the tool that opens up the way and connects with so many other project management artifacts. The work breakdown structure is a scoping and scope management tool. It's a planning tool. It's a resource allocation and resource management tool. It's also the basis for detailed risk identification, and it's therefore a tool for governance. And because of that, it becomes a communication tool and a tool to help you with reporting on project status and progress. It can also, by attaching specifications to the work breakdown structure dictionary, be a quality management tool. And finally, very often it is the basis for integrating all of the other project management tools. In this video, I'll take you through 5 stages and 21 steps for creating a project schedule. Stage 1 is about the schedule framework. You need to start by getting all of the time and date related data assembled and ready to use. Step 1. Start with fixed milestones. Things like the start date and release or delivery dates. Step 2. Add in discretionary milestones. Things like reporting deadlines and release targets. Step 3. Add in calendar constraints. Things like public holidays and company days. Step 4. Add your resource constraints. Things like staff holidays or the delivery schedules for assets or materials that you'll need for your project. Step 5. Consider the number of working hours for each day, and this may be different for different days. Some organisations have shorter working days for the last working day of the week. And remember, if you've got non-working days in the week, as hopefully we all have, then you need to allocate 0 hours to those days. Critically, don't forget that the non-working days may be different in different regions and locations. Stage 2 is the task framework. Here we introduce what we need to do and what we need to do it. Step 6 is to identify the tasks that need to be completed as part of your schedule. These will be in your work breakdown structure, and I'll link in the description to our video on how to create a work breakdown structure. Step 7 is to estimate the work required to complete each task and to do so with the contingency for each task. Step 8 is to identify the dependencies between the tasks. Usually these will be finish to start dependencies, but there are other types of dependencies, and again I'll link to a video which explains all of that. Once you have the dependencies, it will allow you to sequence your tasks. Next, in step 9, add in any lags or leads. A lag is a gap between 2 tasks that are dependent one on the other. For example, task B might start 3 days after task A is complete, allowing, for example, concrete or paint to dry thoroughly before starting task B. A lead is a negative lag. For example, if task B needs to start 2 days before task A is completed, then this is a finish to start dependency with a 2-day lead. Step 10. Identify the resources you need for each task and find out their availability. And once you've done that, allocate the resources to the tasks. Step 11 is to calculate the durations for each task. This calculation uses the work required and the resource assigned. For example, a task that has a work required of 15 days and 2 full-time staff allocated to it will have a duration of 7.5 days. However, if 3 people are allocated to the same task, but for half of their time only, this will lead to a duration of 10 days. Stage 3 is analysis. This is where you turn your data into a plan. At step 12, you can calculate your critical path, or critical paths, and again, I'll link to a handy video. Step 13 is to consider whether you have the right amount of float. Too much float means you're going to take longer than you need to take, but too little float exposes you to too much risk. There's a judgment to be made here. Step 14, review your emerging schedule for business sense. Does this produce a consistent schedule that can deliver when you need to with enough contingency? And are your workloads balanced so that none of your resources are overstretched or indeed overstressed? In step 15, you'll almost inevitably need to revise your draft. Consider your contingency and how much resource you have and how to apply them. Do you need to overlap tasks? Apply additional resources to work in parallel or to get tasks done more quickly? Or do you need to reduce the quality or adjust the scope of what you're doing to complete the project in time? Stage 4 is review, and this is where you expose your draft schedule to a critical review. Step 16 is to expose your draft to a critical review from your team. They should be looking for risks and errors arising from things like fundamental errors in your project strategy, data entry mistakes, incorrect data, calculational errors, false or risky assumptions, missing constraints or missing dependencies, poor reasoning, and of course, risks to the project. Step 17. If this is a critical project, then you may want to expose this to further external review. This could be an independent red team, charged with looking for the same kinds of mistakes, but because they're outside of the team, and they're likely to be even more brutal in their scrutiny. And that's a good thing. Stage 5, sign off. Once you have all of the comments from your reviewers, you are ready. Step 18 is to create your final draft. This is likely to take the form of a Gantt chart, so do take a look at our companion video on how to create a Gantt chart. Step 19 is to submit your final schedule for sign-off by either your project sponsor, your client, your project board, or your steering group. Step 20 is to up-issue your final draft with comments and changes accommodated to version 1. And step 21 is to place your schedule under version control. And yes, we have a video on that too. In an earlier and very popular video, I described what a Gantt chart is in under 5 minutes. But I keep getting asked the question, but Mike, how do you create a Gantt chart? So that's what I'm going to describe in this video. A lot of people will think that creating a Gantt chart starts with first, open the app. But it couldn't be further from the truth. And in this video, I am going to make no assumptions about the tool that you will use to help you create your Gantt chart. That tool could be anything from a pencil and paper to a drawing tool like PowerPoint to a slightly more sophisticated tool like a spreadsheet. Or possibly it's a dedicated project management tool like MS Project or Gantt Pro. Or possibly it's a full-on project management information system. It doesn't matter. The basic process is the same whichever approach you take. And that process has 9 steps. And the first step is to list all of the tasks or activities that you need to carry out. The first place to start is with your work breakdown structure. And whether you use your work breakdown structure to break down the products or the tasks of your project, it doesn't matter. It's a great place to start. If you've used it to create your products, you'll need to do another step to go from product to task. If you've done a task-based work breakdown structure, then you already have your list of tasks organized and grouped in a helpful way. You need a detailed list that covers everything, and you want it grouped logically, possibly in phases, or possibly functionally, or possibly already into work streams. And if you want to know how to create that work breakdown structure, then I'll put a link below to our video on how to create a work breakdown structure. Secondly, set up your constraints. Do any of your tasks have a necessary start date or a necessary completion date that you need to respect? If they do, make sure you note that information. Third, set your task dependencies. Which tasks are dependent upon other tasks? Most commonly, this will be what we call a finish to start dependency. That is, the start of one task is dependent upon the finish of another, hence finish to start. Other dependency types are available, and I talk about those in our video on task dependencies. There are finish to finish dependencies, start to start dependencies, and start to finish dependencies, which are vanishingly rare. Once you have your dependencies, there are 2 things that you can do. And the first is to establish any leads or lags. A lag is what it sounds like. In the case of a finish to start dependency, a lag is the time between the finish of one task and the start of another task which is dependent upon it. If there is no lag, then the second task starts immediately upon the finish of the first, but if there is a lag of 3 days, it will start 3 days later. And a lead is the opposite of a lag. It's a negative lag. So a finish to start dependency with a 3-day lead means that the second task will start 3 days before the expected completion of the first task. Why does this matter? Well, the commonest situation is lags arising from curing or drying times. If you paint a coat of paint on your wall, you can't put the second one on until you've finished the first one. But often there is a lag because you need to let the first coat dry properly. The second thing you can do once you have dependencies is to sequence the tasks within a group, within a work stream, within a phase or a functional grouping. That way, you've got a logical structure to feed into the Gantt chart that you're going to be building. Fourth, we need to allocate resources to our tasks. We need to identify the right people to do the job. We need to discuss it with them, and we need to confirm those allocations. Remember, where 2 tasks have been allocated to the same person, then those 2 tasks can't happen at the same time unless you specifically allocated that person part-time into each of them. So allocating resources to tasks is critical for understanding the sequencing and the scheduling of tasks. Once you know who's going to be working on each task and how much of their time you're going to apply, the next step is to estimate the durations of each task. You need to be mindful of the balance between your desire to push things along as quickly as possible and therefore to estimate the lowest possible duration, and the importance of allowing enough time for people to figure out what it is they're doing and to deal with problems and setbacks along the way. At step 6, you prepare by creating your Gantt chart template or grid. And a Gantt chart grid consists of rows, each of which represents an individual task, and columns, which represent a unit of time, either days or weeks, sometimes months. You can even make them more granular, representing hours, but we don't often do that. And once you've done that, I recommend that you block out right from the start any weekends, holidays, or other unproductive time so that you don't allocate work into those slots inappropriately. Now, I'm not saying you can never work on a weekend, but you need to only plan to do this knowing that it's a decision that you've made and the right thing to do. Remember, if you allocate work into non-productive time, that gives you absolutely zero contingency. So think very carefully before you do it. Step 7 is simple. You've got all the data. Now you need to add your activities onto your Gantt chart grid to create your Gantt chart. And at step 8, you need to add milestones to your Gantt chart too. Now, you can determine what your milestones are going to be right at the beginning of your planning process. These milestone-driven projects or milestone planning set up a framework of milestones that create the constraints within which you plan the activities. And we have a video on milestone planning. I'll put a link below. Alternatively, you can select your milestones from the completion dates of important activities or important groups of activities. And of course, you can always do a combination of both. And I do have other videos on milestones for you to watch. Links below. And finally, at step 9, make your Gantt chart as useful as possible. Apply color coding and shading to make different tasks stand out. But remember, photocopiers are colorblind, so if you're going to use color, make sure you use shading as well, so that anyone who can't easily read color can still distinguish between the tasks. You can also use colors or labels to assign resources to tasks to make it easy for people to find out who is doing what. And you may want to add arrows to indicate dependencies between tasks. Finally, an additional part of this step, which is essential before you finish making your Gantt chart as useful as possible, is to add a key or a legend to your Gantt chart. Because if you have used some form of coding, there are no standards. Therefore, for anyone to be able to read and interpret your Gantt chart, they have to know what the different symbols mean. And if you don't provide it for them, it's not their fault, it's yours. Gantt charts are the poster child for project management, but they are only one part of the larger project planning process. And if you want to know how they fit in, do take a look at our video on the project planning process and how it works. If you've enjoyed and learned from this video, please do give it a like. And I'll be creating loads more great project management content, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.